5.6 million Americans live with Alzheimer's today. Another 100,000 are estimated to be living with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Today's guest is a brain scientist whose novels describe not what it's like to die from these diseases, but what it's like to live with them. She's Lisa Genova this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host, G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. We do that by visiting each week with the best contemporary storytellers, authors, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists, really anyone using or studying narrative to explain the world in which we live. This week, we're joined by best-selling author Lisa Genova, a Harvard-trained neuroscientist. Her books show the reader what it's like to live with neurological disease and conditions. Her latest novel is Every Note Played. Lisa, we're thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jim.
Now, our audience probably doesn't know this, but you were actually our very first guest on a pilot where we really learned how not to produce a television show. So we're
Not
thrilled.
because of anything you did.
It wasn't what you did.
Thank you for
It was what
clarifying,
we
yes.
did. And we just want to thank you for coming back.
Oh my God, I'm thrilled to see you guys again. Thanks for having me.
Well, so, you have this remarkable biography, a Harvard-trained neuroscientist who has found this calling, this life in storytelling, in fiction in particular. What drew you to fiction?
Yeah, it's a really weird career path for a neuroscientist. I don't know any other neuroscientists who write novels. It really began with my grandmother. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in the late 90s, and I come from a really large Italian family. We live up in the Boston area. And as the neuroscientist in this big family, I figured it was probably my responsibility to understand this neurological disease as best as possible and pass that education along excuse me, to my aunts who were her primary caregivers. And so I learned everything I could about this disease. So I learned about the molecular neurobiology, I learned about the clinical management, I learned about the disease progression and the symptoms, I learned about caregiving. But in all of that education, it lacked the answer to this question. What does it feel like to have Alzheimer's? And that was the question that was haunting me, because I could understand her as a neuroscientist, but even after all that education, I still had no idea how to understand her as a granddaughter. I didn't know how to simply be with her. And while all of us had lots of sympathy for her, so it was, I could feel really bad for my grandmother and all the memories she was losing and all of the identity and the confusion and the bewilderment, and it was heartbreaking and so upsetting and unnerving, and it made us all really uncomfortable, and we felt bad for her, and we felt bad for us. But I didn't know how to feel with her. And that's the distinction between sympathy and empathy. And I had this intuitive thought, which was, well, fiction is the place where you can explore empathy. Stories give us the chance to walk in someone else's shoes. And so I thought, well, that book didn't exist. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book about a woman with Alzheimer's and tell it from her perspective. And maybe then I'll get this insight, this empathy that I was searching for.
And so the science, knowing the science, understanding the clinical presentation of these diseases is one thing. How do you do the research to get into understanding really what it's like to live with, whether we're talking about ALS in your most recent book or Alzheimer's or any other brain conditions and diseases you've written about?
Right, thanks. So yes, I've written about Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, autism, Huntington's disease, and ALS. And for all of them, it's sort of the same kind of research. So I read everything I can, from the very scientific, most current research papers to the medical textbooks, to the first-person accounts, to the caregiver's point of view. Then I go into the medical community, and I want to know anyone who touches that patient. So the neurologists, the nurses, the care specialists, the OTs, the PTs, speech pathologists, anyone. But then I get to know the real experts, and it's the people who have it. And so, for example, with Still Alice, I came to know 27 people still in the early stages of Alzheimer's who could communicate what it feels like to have it. And I was in touch with them every day for the year and a half that I was writing Still Alice. So they really give me the insights. And it's amazing that these folks share with me what's going on with them at the most vulnerable, uncertain times of their lives. Excuse me. It's such an honor and a privilege, and it really instills in me a sense of enormous responsibility to give their story, their journey, a face and a voice. Because for so many people diagnosed with these diseases and conditions, people don't want to talk about Alzheimer's. It's scary, or it's depressing, or I don't really understand, autism or ALS. And so it makes me uncomfortable. And what do we human beings hate to be uncomfortable. So if I'm not familiar with that and it's a little scary, I'm probably just going to not look at it. And so if we're talking about Alzheimer's, I've just turned my back on about 50 million people worldwide.